The Prime Minister is set to hold an emergency meeting with senior police officers in Downing Street following a second night of violence across England. The meeting in Downing Street comes after scenes of unrest in London, Hartlepool and Manchester overnight, with a demonstration in Aldershot which saw a tense standoff with riot police. In London, more than 100 people were arrested after protesters in Whitehall launched beer cans and glass bottles at police and threw flares at the statue of Sir Winston Churchill in Parliament Square. Times Radio's Daryl Morris was there and spoke to some of the protesters.
What do you think's brought me here? English and proud, and these poor three little girls that murdered.
You've got a picture of you've got the pictures of the three girls that were murdered in Southport on a
Yep,
T-shirt.
That's right. Yes, I have. And it shouldn't be happening, should it?
Enough is enough.
Yeah, enough is enough.
Yeah,
That's it.
quite simple, really.
And when you say enough of what?
Enough of letting all the illegals in, and it stopped the boats. Look, it's clearly not working. Look, we know that
We
they're
don't
like,
know who's coming in,
yeah,
do we?
you don't know who's coming in. They're all unvetted and that. Everyone, all kids are getting stabbed on the streets, and they're not doing nothing about it. Do you know what I mean?
I suppose the question is, though, is there a connection between asylum and what happened in Southport?
Asylum seeker, mate. Yeah, it's all the same.
Is it all the same?
mate? It's all the same.
Well, that was Times Radio's Daryl Morris speaking to protesters in Westminster last night. One comment in from Phil Hendrick. He says, I'm curious to know why there was zero reporting of the Downing Street protests on the BBC last night. Well, there certainly was here. Let's talk now to the former Counter-terrorism Policing National Coordinator, Nick Aldworth. Mr. Aldworth, what's your understanding of what's happening around the country with these protests?
Yeah, good morning. Well, first of all, wasn't that a depressing little segue to listen to? Look, what we've seen is opportunism from what I think traditionally will be described as the right wing. And we're seeing various reports of how that's been initiated. Those reports specifically relate to misinformation about the person involved in the awful murders in Southport. But I think more broadly, we're probably seeing rent-a-mob just looking for any excuse. And I think the risk that we face across the country at the moment is that the conditions are set for one of those awful summers of violence, similar to that which we saw in 2011, where a single event acts as a spark to satellite the rest of the country. So I'm sure that Sir Keir will be speaking to the police chiefs in that context today. Having met him myself, I do believe he's an honest and trustworthy man. So when he offers his support, that's well meant. And I suspect he'll be asking them if there's anything more that the government can do in terms of legislation. As a new government, they'll be fairly light on legislation going through Parliament for a few months. And are there any opportunities for secondary legislation to be nipped into Parliament quickly?
What legislation to deal with protests in particular?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, the difficulty is EDL is an amorphous organisation. In fact, it's barely an organisation. It's just a conglomerate of people who suggest that they exist under that banner, but it doesn't really have any ideology as such, and it certainly doesn't meet the threshold commonly for terrorism, and therefore it can't be a proscribed organisation. But it does seem that wherever they gather under that banner, violence follows quite quickly. And now there are police powers to deal with violent protests. There are new police powers from last year to deal with disruptive protest. But I think there's possibly a little bit of a gap in the legislative agenda, or sort of a legislative toolbox that still allows these people who we know will resort to violence to actually gather on our streets in the first place.
Do you think it was a mistake to involve counter-terrorism police in looking into what happened in Southport? Because that appears to have sort of rung bells with some of these protesters.
No, it'd be a mistake not to. And the reason I say that is on anything as serious as this, you really do need to go big early, because if you don't take advantage of early evidential opportunities, you run the risk of missing critical evidence. And so the inclusion of consultation with Northwest Counter-terrorism Unit would have been an absolutely natural thing to do anywhere in the country, in any context.
And can anything be done to clarify the facts of the circumstances at an earlier stage? Because clearly it was false stories spreading on social media which inspired some of these protests.
I think Merseyside did a reasonably good job of trying to generate a counter narrative. Their hands on this occasion were a little bit tied, given the age of the subject, well, now offender, the accused, and given the sensitivities around the incident that was still very much under investigation. But one of the criticisms I will offer to my former colleagues, generally we're not very good at the moment in living in the world of social media. And we've been in this world now for 10 or 15 years or more, where narratives are put on video, they are put across mass media platforms. They sometimes show police wrongdoing. They sometimes show police right doing, but out of context that makes it look like wrongdoing. And these things become a trigger for criticism of the police. And on this occasion, narratives appear to become a trigger for violence. We definitely need to get much, much better at how we manage that.
Is there any way, though, frankly, of, in a free society, of really sorting out what's being put up online?
Look, I think it's incredibly difficult. And the other thing that we're battling with is that some of this material was pushed out through hostile states seeking to disrupt and interfere with our social values. So I'm definitely not suggesting this is an easy one. I think the answer in most cases is a very quick counter narrative using influencers, trusted influencers, because a lot of the people who take their advice from online platforms do so through influencers. We need to generate a counter narrative on that basis.
And you've drawn a parallel with the riots in this country in 2011. I mean, there just does seem to be sociologically a kind of long, hot summer. I know it hasn't been a long summer, but it has been hot recently to these kind of summer disturbances.
Yeah, almost always. When you look through the history of violent nationwide protests, it always pretty much happens in that long, hot period of July, August. It happens through one event, possibly on some occasions through a sort of fermentation process. And I think, that actually exists in the UK at the moment. We've seen a lot of high profile problems inside policing. We have seen events like this awful murder in Southport, and these things just become an excuse for those who wish to commit violence to come onto the streets and do so. There's no legitimacy in the protests at all, because we see the problems with policing being dealt with really robustly. We see police officers going to prison. We see investigations happening very quickly. It's just an excuse.
Nick Aldworth, thank you very much indeed.